Easter, I usually like making some sort of bread that we eat with our Easter brunch on that Sunday. So one of my favorites is this braided Easter wreath that has little egg holders. So that's what I'm going to be showing you how to make today. So that being said, we need to make a yeast dough. So for that, I'm going to be using a good splash of vanilla, a pinch of salt, 21 grams of yeast. So I have fresh yeast here, that's why it's 21 grams. You can just as easily use dried yeast as well, or whatever you have. 75 grams of sugar, 2 room temperature eggs, as well as some dried lemon zest. You can also use dried orange zest or just leave it out. I also have 250 grams of warm, heavy cream. So using cream, it basically allows me to skip an ingredient. If you would prefer to use milk, you can just as easily use 250 grams of warm milk. Then I would just recommend adding 50 to 70 grams of some melted or room temperature softened butter as well into your dough, just to give it a little more oil and fat. That way it'll be really elastic and it won't stick as much. And the last ingredient is 500 grams of all-purpose flour. All right, let's get started then. So because I have my chunk of frozen yeast here, I'm just going to start by letting it thaw. So to kind of quicken that up, I'm just going to add maybe like this much of my warm liquid. Again, you can use cream or milk, doesn't really matter. I'm just going to let that sit for about 10 minutes. Hopefully it'll be thawed by then. And then I'm also going to add some of my sugar to help the blooming process. In the meantime, I'm also just going to add my flour into my big mixing bowl and make a little hole in the middle where all of our wet ingredients are going to go in. And then I'm going to sprinkle the dried lemon zest and the salt just on the outer edge and not inside of the hole. So my yeast has completely dissolved into the cream. So at this point, I'm going to add about half of the sugar, give it one mix, and then just let that sit for another 10 minutes. And the rest of the sugar I'm already going to put into our little flour hole here. At this point, we're just going to add all of our wet ingredients into the little hole that we made and then just knead it for 5 to 10 minutes or until it's come together really nicely. And again, I'm going to be using my KitchenAid, but you can just as easily use a hand mixer or just do it by hand. Alright, so you know when your dough has been kneading enough, when it kind of doesn't stick to the sides of the bowl, and it's also not really sticky to the touch because of the high percentage of fat from the cream that's in here, which is really nice. So it'll be really easy to knead with our hands now. Alright, like I just said, we're going to knead this with our hands now for another couple of minutes to get it into a nice round ball. Now I love this type of yeast dough, this sweet yeast dough, because it has that milk or cream in it, which makes it really easy to handle because it's not sticking everywhere. And it also just smells delicious. Now, like I showed you in the pizza video, all I'm basically doing is grabbing dough from the outside and then bringing it in and pushing it into the center with the bottom palm. And this will just kind of allow a nice, smooth, tight surface on the outside of your dough ball. Now, if your dough was to be sticking, you could always add a little bit more flour into your dough. as well as just use some flour sprinkled onto your surface to help knead it. Now there's two ways you could go about this now. So you could either take this whole dough ball and just let this proof for about an hour in a warm place. And then once it's done proofing, split it into your 3 little dough balls to make your braid. Or what I'm going to do is I'm going to split it into my 3 dough balls now, and then just let each of those balls proof in their own little bowl. I find it just saves me a step later, even though it's not really saving me a step, I'm just doing it earlier. It's just what I prefer, but it's up to you. And because I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to measure out my dough balls to make sure every single one is the exact same weight. That being said, I'm going to measure this whole thing, then divide it by 3, and then shape my 3 little balls. I'm just gonna make sure each of these dough balls has a really nice, smooth, tight surface on the outside. Alright, so I've got my 3 bowls here, and I'm also going to rub each little dough ball in a tiny bit of neutral oil. That'll just help to prevent any sort of film or drying out of the dough. Just gonna rub it on both sides and then put it seam down into the bowl. Now these just need to be covered with either saran wrap or a kitchen towel, and I'm going to let them proof in a warm spot for about an hour or until they've doubled in size. Now, as we know, I'm very impatient. So to help the proofing process, I preheated my oven just a little bit just to get a little bit of warm air in there. So I'm probably going to end up sticking these into the oven. If you do that, just make sure your oven's not hot, it's just a little bit warm. All right, so I'll see you in an hour, give or take. My doughs have proofed for about an hour and a half, and you know when they're all done proofing, when you can do the finger test. So that's basically when you push into the dough and it comes back about halfway. If it doesn't come back at all, it means it's underproofed, and if it comes back too fast, it means it's overproofed. So for me, it took about like that hour and a half, but it might take a little bit longer depending on how warm or cold it is in your house or where you are. All right, so now that these have proofed, we just have to make our wreath and our braid. So I'm basically going to kind of roll out each of my little dough balls here. So it's about maybe this length. And then I'm simply going to braid it, tie the ends together, and put it onto my baking tray. All right, so I'm kind of making it into like a hot dog bun shape, or like an oval. I'm just going to start slowly spreading it out. Kind of going from the center out to the ends. And you want it to be kind of even. All right, I'm gonna let this one rest for a little bit while I roll out the other ones. Now I'm making the ends just a tiny bit thinner than the rest, just because I'm going to be pinching them together anyways, and to hide them better, it's easier if they're a little bit thinner. Just trying to make them all kind of the same length. Now all I have to do is braid these together. You can even just leave your braid like this if you want, but I'm going to turn it into a wreath. So I'm kind of just going to make a little circle and then try to pinch the different pieces together, if that makes sense. Just gonna slide this onto my baking tray. Another thing you can do is make these little eggs out of tin foil and stick them into your wreath. That way when it's done baking, you'll have little spots where you can put some hard-boiled eggs. So for the final touches, I've got an egg yolk with a tiny splash of cream that I've already mixed up here. I've also got some coarse salt and some almond slivers and those tinfoil egg-like things that we just made. Now all I'm going to do is find some nice spots on my wreath to kind of stick these tinfoil eggs in. Then I'm going to brush on some of this egg yolk and then sprinkle on some almonds and some of this coarse salt. Now you can put any toppings on that you want. You can also add raisins into your dough if you want, or really anything. It's totally up to you. But this is just what I'm going to do for now. Now while the oven is preheating to 180 degrees Celsius, I'm just going to leave this on top of the stove just to proof for a couple more minutes. Now the wreath just needs to bake for about 30-35 minutes or until it's nice and golden brown. Once the wreath has cooled down a little bit, we can remove these tin foil eggs and put in our hard-boiled eggs, and then it's all done.